fall asleep yet. What do you teach, Daniel? He angled his face up, his cheek still resting on her hip. Mostly English. That's my favorite. Really?
Hello there, and
I was
welcome
horrible
to this
at all the
first
humanities.
round of the tournament.
I liked science best.
Anticipation is
He
rampant
made a
today.
face.
Let's see what you do.
Science. She heard the woman beside him mutter, drunk, to her other neighbor. Shouldn't have told you I was a teacher. He sighed heavily. Why not? Women don't like that. Randall says never volunteer the information. The way he said the words made it clear he was quoting this Randall verbatim.
Nice. Should be in the
But
fairway.
teaching is a noble profession, educating the future doctors and scientists of the world. He looked up at her sadly.
Looking at
There's no money in it.
125 yards.
Not every woman is so mercenary. Randall is dating the wrong type. My wife liked money. Ex-wife. Sorry to hear that. He sighed again and closed his eyes. It broke my heart. Another twinge of pity, of sadness. He would never say these things, she knew, if he weren't high on her ecstasy truth serum hybrid. He was speaking more clearly now. The drug wasn't wearing off, his mind was just adapting to working around it. She patted his cheek and made her voice cheery. If she was that easily bought, she probably isn't worth crying over. His eyes opened again. They were a very gentle hazel, an even mix of green and soft gray. She tried to picture them intense, fitting under the baseball cap of the self-assured man meeting with De La Fuentes in the photos, and failed. She didn't know what she would do if he actually had dissociative identity disorder. She'd never worked with that before. You're right, he said. I know you are. I need to see her for what she really was, not what I imagined she was.
Okay, this one to
Exactly.
save par.
We build up these ideas of people, create the one we want to be with, and then try to keep the real person inside the false mold. It doesn't always work out well. Gibberish. She had no idea what she was saying. She'd been in one semi-serious relationship in her whole life, and it hadn't lasted long. School had been prioritized before the guy, just like work had been prioritized before everything else for 6 years. Like how she now prioritized breathing over everything else. She had a problem with obsessiveness. Alex? Yes? Am I dying? She smiled reassuringly. No. If I thought you were dying, I would have called an ambulance. You'll be fine. I just want to double check. Okay. Will I have to have blood taken? Maybe. He sighed. Needles make me nervous. It will be fine. She didn't like that this bothered her,
here.
lying
Hopefully not
to
a
him.
sign of
But
things
there was
to come.
something about his simple trust, the way he
Okay,
seemed
hole
to
number
ascribe
two.
the
Let's see
best
what you can do
motives
here.
to everything she did. She had to snap out of it. Thank you, Alex. Really. Just doing my job. Not a lie. Do you think you'll call me? He asked hopefully. Daniel, we're definitely going to spend an evening together, she promised. If he hadn't been drugged, he would have heard the edge in her voice and seen the ice in her eyes. Chapter 5. The rest went almost too smoothly. Did that mean something? Her paranoia level was already so high, it was hard to say if this new worry elevated it or not. He got into the cab at the Roslyn station without protest. She knew how he felt. She and Barnaby had tried out most of the non-lethal preparations to have some concrete experience with what they could do. This one was like dreaming a pleasant dream, where problems and worries were for someone else to figure out, and all one needed was a hand to hold and a nudge in the right direction. In their notes, they'd nicknamed it Follow the Leader,
Heading towards
though it
the
had a
beach
more
here.
impressive
Not
name
the
on the
good
official
kind.
reports. It was a relaxing trip,
Well, you're in the
and if
sand,
it weren't for the
so,
fact that she
let's
desperately needed
just
her
get out of there
inhibitions,
and
even back
move
then,
on with our lives.
she might have indulged again. She got him talking about the volleyball team he coached. He'd asked if he'd be back at school in time for practice, and he spent the entire cab ride telling her about the girls until she felt she knew all their names and their strengths on the court by heart. The cabbie paid no attention, humming along to some song too low for her to make out. Daniel seemed mostly oblivious to the travel, but at a particularly long red light, he looked up and frowned. Your office is far away. Yes, it is, she agreed. It's a hell of a commute. Where do you live? Bethesda. That's a nice place. Columbia Heights is not so nice. My part of it, at least. The cab started moving again. She was pleased. The plan was going very well. Even if they'd clocked her getting on and off the last train, they'd be hard-pressed to keep track of one cab in a sea of identical cabs, twisting together through rush hour. Preparation felt like a magic spell sometimes. Like you could force events into the shape you wanted just by planning them thoroughly enough. Daniel wasn't as talkative now.
This
was the second phase of the drug's action,
see what happens here.
And he would be getting more tired. She needed him to stay awake just a little bit longer. Why did you give me your number? She asked when his lids started to droop. He smiled dreamily. I've never done that before. Me either. I'll probably be embarrassed about it later. Not if I call you, though, right? Maybe. I don't know. It was out of character. So why did you do it? His soft eyes never left hers. I like your face.
Looks like you'll be in the short stuff here.
I really wanted to see it again. That made me brave. She frowned, guilt pulsing.
All right, we're right around 125 yards out.
He seemed worried. No, it sounds very sweet. Not many men would tell a woman something like that. He blinked owlishly. I wouldn't, usually. Too cowardly. You seem pretty brave to me. I feel different. I think it's you. I felt different as soon as I saw you smile. As soon as I roofied you, she amended in her head. Well, that's quite a compliment, she said. And here we go. Can you get up? Sure. This is the airport. Yes, that's where my car is. His brow furrowed, then cleared. Did you just get back from a trip? I just got into town, yes. I go on trips sometimes. I like to go to Mexico. She glanced up sharply. He was staring ahead, watching where he was walking. There was no sign of distress on his face. If she pushed him toward a secret, anything that was a pressure point, his docility would turn to suspicion. He might latch on to another stranger as his leader and try to escape. He might get agitated and call attention to her. What do you like about Mexico? She asked carefully. The weather is hot and dry. I enjoy that. I've never lived in a really hot place, but I think I would like it. I get burned.
Okay, 11-footer here.
I've never been able to
definitely
tan.
makeable.
You look like you've spent some time in the sun. Nope, just born this way. She got her coloring from her absentee father. Genetic testing had informed her that he was a mix of many things, predominantly Korean, Hispanic, and Welsh. She'd always wondered what he'd looked like. The combination with her mother's Scottish background had created in her an oddly ordinary face. She could have been from almost anywhere. That must be nice. I have to use sunblock. A lot
well done.
of sunblock.
We're in the hole.
Or I peel. It's disgusting. I shouldn't tell you
And
that.
that'll keep you at one
She
over
laughed.
for the round.
I promise to forget it. What else do you like? Working with my hands.
Coming
I
off
help
a
build
par
houses.
on the last one.
Not
Let's
in
see
a
what happens
skilled
here.
way. I just hammer where they tell me to, but the people are so kind and generous. I love that part. It was all very convincing, and she felt a thrill of fear. How could he stick to the story so well, so effortlessly, with the chemicals moving through his system right now? Unless he'd built up a resistance somehow. Unless her department had created an antidote.
Heading for the
unless they
green
prepped him,
here.
and he was playing her. The goosebumps stood up on the back of
you're
her
on the
neck.
green with
It didn't have to
a
be
whole
the
lot of work to
department
do
that had
for
prepared
the
him.
next shot.
It could be his interactions with De La Fuentes. Who knew what kind of results strange drugs interacting with her own would have? She touched her tongue to the false cap on her back tooth. The department would have just killed her if that were the goal. De La Fuentes would probably want to punish her for attempting to interrupt his plans. But how would he know in advance? How could Daniel have made her as an opposing agent so quickly? She didn't even actually work for anyone anymore. Stick to the plan, she told herself. Get him in the car, and you're in the clear. Sort of. I like the houses there, too, he was saying. You never close the windows, just let the air blow through. Some don't even have glass. It's a lot nicer than Columbia Heights, I can tell you. Maybe not nicer than Bethesda. I bet doctors live in nice houses.
Keep you at 1 over
Not me.
for the round.
Boring vanilla apartment. I don't spend much time there, so it doesn't matter.
And from the 5th hole tee off.
You're out saving lives. Well, not really. I'm not an ER doctor or anything. You're saving my life. Wide gray-green eyes. Total trust. She knew that if this behavior was genuine, it was the drug talking, but it still made her uneasy. She could only keep playing her role. I'm just checking up on you. You're not dying. That much was true. The boys back at the department might have ended up killing this man. At least she could spare him that. Though, after she prevented the catastrophe, Daniel Beach would never see the outside of a prison cell again. Which made her feel 1,000,000 dead. Innocent, tiny babies. Sweet, elderly grandmas. The first horseman of the apocalypse on a white steed. Oh, a bus too, he said mildly. This one takes us to my car. Then you won't have to walk anymore. I don't mind. I like walking with you. He smiled down at her, and his feet tangled on his way up the steps. She steadied him before he could fall, then maneuvered him into the closest seat on the mostly empty bus. Do you like foreign films? He asked, apropos of nothing. Some of them, I guess. There's a good theater at the university. Maybe if the dinner goes well, we could try some subtitles the next time. I'll make a deal with you, she said. If you still like me after one evening together, I will definitely see a movie I can't understand with you. He smiled, his lids drooping. I'll still like you. This was totally ridiculous. There should have been some way to direct this conversation away from flirting. Why was she the one feeling like the monster here? Okay, she was a monster, but she'd come to terms with that, mostly. And she knew she was the kind of monster that needed to exist for the sake of the common good. In some ways, she was like a normal physician. She had to cause pain to save lives. Like cutting off a gangrenous limb to save the rest of the body. Just disassociated. Pain here, savior elsewhere.
25-footer from
and
here
elsewhere
to the cup.
Was much more deserving of the save. Just rationalizing as she always had so that she could live with herself. She never outright lied to herself, though. She knew she didn't exist in some moral gray area. She existed entirely in the black. But the only thing worse than Alex doing her job well was someone else doing it badly. Or no one doing it at all. But even if she fully embraced the label monster, she was never the kind of monster who killed innocent people. She wasn't even going to kill this very guilty one, who was still looking up at her from under his long curls with big hazel puppy dog eyes.
Sitting at
Dead
2 over for the
babies,
round.
she chanted to herself. Dead babies, dead babies, dead
Okay,
babies.
hole number 6.
She'd never wanted to be a spy or work undercover, but now she saw that she was also emotionally unsuited for the job. Apparently she had too much gratuitous sympathy floating around inside her body, which was more than ironic. This is why you never talked to your subject before you talked to him. Okay, Daniel, off we go. Can you stand up? Mm-hmm. Oh, here, let me take your bag. He lifted a hand weakly toward her briefcase. I got it. Though in truth, her fingers were pins and needles around the handle. You need to focus on your balance right now. I'm really tired. I know. Look, my car is right there. The silver one. There are a lot of silver ones. Exactly the point. It's right here. Okay, let's put you in the back so you can lie down. Why don't you take off your coat? I don't want you to get too warm. And the shoes. There we go. Less for her to manage later. Bend your knees up so your legs will fit. Perfect. He had his head pillowed on the backpack now, which surely wasn't that comfortable, but he was past caring. "You're so nice, Alex," he murmured, his eyes closed now. "You're the nicest woman I ever met." "I think you're nice too, Daniel," she admitted. "Thanks," he half articulated, and then he was asleep. Quickly,
And that'll keep
she pulled the
you
beige throw
at 2
out of the
over
trunk.
for the round.
It was the same color as the seats. She covered him with it. She pulled a syringe
you're
from
gonna
her
put this in
bag
the,
and inserted it
fairway?
into a vein in his ankle, hunching her body so it blocked any outside view of what she was doing. Follow the leader would wear off in an hour or so, and she needed him to sleep longer than that. Not an agent, she decided. An agent might have played along with her kidnap drug, but he would never have let himself get knocked out like this. The temporary lab she had created was in rural West Virginia. She'd rented a nice little farmhouse with a milking barn that had been a very long time without cows. The exterior of the barn was a white composite siding that matched the house. Inside, the walls and ceiling were lined in aluminum. The floors were sealed concrete with conveniently spaced drains. There was a little bunk room in the back. It had been advertised as extra space for visiting guests. Delightfully rustic. She was sure there were many naive travelers who would find the rusticity charming, but all she cared was that the electricity and water were hooked up and running. The farmhouse and barn were situated in the middle of a 240-acre apple orchard, which was in turn surrounded by more acres of farmland. The closest neighbor was over a mile away.
I don't know if this has enough.
The owners of this orchard were making money during the off-season by renting out the space to city dwellers who wanted to pretend they were roughing it. It was very expensive. She frowned every time she thought about the price, but it couldn't be helped. She needed a secluded facility with a usable space. She'd been working nights to get everything ready. During the day, she had followed Daniel from a good distance, then caught up on what sleep she could in the car during school hours. She was completely exhausted at the moment, but she still had a lot to do before her workday was over. First stop, a minor freeway exit more than an hour out of the city. A narrow dirt road that looked as if no one had used it in a decade took her deeper into the trees. It must have led somewhere, but she didn't drive far enough to see where. She stopped under a thick patch of shade, cut the engine, and went to work. If Daniel was employed by the department, or more likely, one of the organizations that worked closely with it, the CIA, a few military sections, some other black ops floaters that, like the department, didn't have official names, he would have an electronic tracker on him, just like she'd once had. Absently, she rubbed her finger across the small raised scar on the nape of her neck, covered by her short hair. They liked to tag the head. If only one part of a body could be recovered, the head was best for identification purposes. She opened the back passenger side door and knelt on the damp ground beside Daniel's head. She started with the place both she and Barnaby had been tagged, brushing her fingers lightly along his skin, then again, pressing harder. Nothing. She'd seen a few foreign subjects whose trackers had been freshly removed from behind their ears, so she checked there next. Then she ran her fingers through his hair, probing the scalp for any bumps or hard spots that shouldn't be there. His curls were very soft and smelled nice, citrusy. Not that she cared about his hair, but at least she didn't have to put her hands into some greasy, malodorous nest. She appreciated that. Now for the heavy lifting. If it was De La Fuente's keeping tabs on this man, the tracker would probably be external. She threw the shoes into the woods beside the road first. They seemed the most likely culprit of his clothes. Lots of men would wear the same pair every day. Then, she stripped off his shirt, grateful for the button-down, though it was still hard to get it out from under the weight of his body. She didn't bother trying to get the undershirt over his head. She pulled a blade from her pocket, untaped it, and cut the fabric into 3 easily removable pieces. She scanned his chest. No suspicious scars or lumps. The skin on his torso was fairer than his arms. He had a faint farmer's tan, no doubt from building houses in Mexico with a t-shirt on, or from acquiring superviruses in Egypt, also very sunny. He had
Nice.
what she thought of as sports muscles rather than gym muscles. No hard-cut edges, just a nice, smooth alignment that showed he was active without being obsessive. Rolling him onto his stomach was hard, and he fell into the foot space, draped over the hump between seats. He had 2 light scars on his left shoulder blade, parallel and even in length. She explored them carefully, prodding the skin all around, but she couldn't feel anything besides the normal fibrous, hypertrophic tissue that should be there. It didn't take her long to realize she should have removed his jeans before rolling him over. She had to climb on top of his awkwardly positioned form and reach both arms around his torso to get the button fly open. So very thankful that he was not wearing skinny jeans. She then climbed out the other passenger side door and yanked the pants off over his feet. She was unsurprised to see that he wore boxers rather than briefs. It fit his clothing profile. She stripped the boxers off, then the socks, and then she grabbed up the rest of the clothes, walked them a few feet off the road, and stuffed them behind a fallen log. She made another trip for the backpack. The laptop would be a very good hiding place for any electronic device someone wanted him to carry around unknowingly.
And
This wasn't the first time she'd had to strip a target down herself. In the laboratory environment, she'd had people who prepped a subject for her.
The 9th hole coming
Barnaby called them the underlings. But she hadn't always been in the lab. And during her first field trip to Herat, Afghanistan, she'd learned to be deeply grateful to the underlings. Stripping down a man who hadn't bathed in months was not pleasant, especially when she didn't have a shower available for herself afterward. At least Daniel was clean. She was the only one working up a sweat today. She found the screwdriver in the trunk and quickly changed the DC license plate for one she'd pulled off a similar car in a West Virginia scrapyard. Just to be thorough, she did a cursory examination of the backs of his legs, the bottom of his feet, and his hands. She'd never seen a tracker on the extremities, probably because extremities sometimes got cut off to make a point. She didn't see any scars.
150
she
yards
also didn't see any calluses that suggested he trained with guns or used them frequently. He had soft teacher hands, with just a few hard spots that spoke of blisters from inexperienced labor. She tried to roll him back up onto the seat, but quickly realized it was a vain effort. It wasn't a comfortable sleeping position, but he wouldn't wake up regardless. He would be sore later, though it was completely ridiculous to even think of that. As she repositioned the blanket and tucked it around his body as best she could, she was constructing a story about him from the documents she'd read and the evidence in front of her. She believed Daniel Beach was mostly the man she saw now, the pleasant, all-around good guy. The attraction for the avaricious ex was understandable. He was probably easy to fall in love with. After some time had passed, enough time for the ex to take love for granted, she would have been able to shift her focus to the things she didn't have. The nice apartment, the big ring, the cars. She probably missed this side of Daniel now, the grass always being greener and whatnot. But there was also darkness in Daniel, buried deep, perhaps born from the pain and unfairness of losing his parents, aggravated by his wife's betrayal, and then ignited by the loss of his final family member. That darkness would not surface easily. He would compartmentalize it, keep it away from this gentle life, pack it into the dark spaces where it fit. No wonder he could speak of Mexico so blithely. He would have 2 Mexicos, the happy one the teacher loved, and the dangerous one the monster thrived in. They probably weren't anything close to the same place in his head. Not a true psychotic, she hoped. Just a fractured man who didn't want to give up the person he thought of as himself, but who needed the release the darkness gave him.
Now that was a swing.
She felt comfortable with this assessment, and it changed her plan a little. There was a great deal of performance to what she did. For some subjects, the very clinical and emotionless persona worked best. white coat,
Okay,
surgical
180
mask,
yards
and
from the
shiny
pin here.
stainless steel. For others, it was the threat of the crazed sadist, though Barnaby was always more successful with that play. He had the face and hair for it. Unruly spikes of white. I've just been electrocuted hair. Every situation was slightly different. Some feared the darkness, some the light. She'd been planning to go clinical. It was the most comfortable role in her wheelhouse. But she decided now that Daniel would need to be surrounded by darkness to let that side come to the surface. And Dark Daniel was the one she needed to talk to. She did a little evasive driving on the way in. If someone had been tracking Daniel's clothes or possessions, she didn't want that person coming along any farther on this trip. She considered the possibilities again for the millionth time. Column 1, this was a very elaborate trap. Column 2, this was for real and 1 million lives were on the line, not to mention her own. During her long drive, the balance finally shifted to rest solidly on one side. This wasn't a government agent in her car. She was sure of that. And if he was an innocent citizen, picked at random to draw her out, then they'd already missed their best opportunities to bag her. There hadn't been one attack, not one attempt to follow her, that she'd seen. She thought of the mountains of incriminating information on Daniel Beach,
at
and
3
she couldn't
over
help
for the
herself.
round.
She was a believer, so she'd better get to work saving
Hole
lives.
number 11.
She pulled into the farmhouse drive around 11, dead tired and starving, but 95% sure that there was no trail that could lead either the department or De La Fuentes to her doorstep. She looked the house over quickly, checking to see if anyone had broken in and died, as he or she would have upon opening the door. And then, after disarming her safeguards, she drove the car into the barn. As soon as she'd pulled the barn door shut and reset the alarm, she went to work getting Daniel prepped. All the other tasks were done. She'd bought timers from a Home Depot in Philly and plugged lamps into them in several rooms of the farmhouse. Like a traveler, leaving for a few weeks, she made certain that the place looked occupied. A radio was plugged into one of the timers so there would be noise, too. The house was good bait. Most people would clear that before progressing to the dark barn. The barn would stay dark. She'd constructed a kind of tent in the middle of the barn space that would hide light and muffle sound, while also keeping Daniel completely ignorant of his surroundings. It was a rectangular cube, about 7 feet high, 10 feet wide, and 15 feet long. It was constructed of PVC pipe, black tarps, and bungee cords, and it was lined inside with 2 layers of egg foam duct-taped into place. It was rough, but more functional than a cave, and she'd handled that in the past. In the center of the tent was an oversized metal slab with black accordion legs that could be adjusted for height. It had been on display in the barn, for authenticity, no doubt, and was some kind of veterinarian's operating table. It was bigger than she needed. This vet had been dealing with cows, not kittens, but still quite a find. It was one of the items that had pushed her over the edge into renting this extortionate tourist trap. There was another metal top table that she'd set up as a desk with her computer, the monitors, and a tray of things that would hopefully only be props. The IV pole was next to the head of the table, a bag of saline already hanging. A wheeled metal cart from the kitchen was positioned beside the pole. A mass of tiny but ominous-looking syringes were lined up in easy view on a stainless steel tray. There was a gas mask and a pressure cuff on the wire rack below the syringes. And of course, the restraints she'd bought on eBay, prison medical facility grade, which she'd chained into place through holes she'd laboriously drilled into the stainless steel slab. No one was escaping from those restraints without outside help, and that helper might need a blowtorch. She'd left herself 2 exits, just openings in the tarp like the partings in a curtain. Outside the tent, she had a cot, her sleeping bag, a hot plate, a small refrigerator, and all the other things she would need. There was a little 3-piece bathroom attached to the bunkhouse, but it was too far away for her to sleep in, and there was no tub anyway, just a shower. She'd have to forego her usual arrangements this weekend. She used mover straps to haul Daniel's inert form out of the car and onto a refrigerator dolly, bumping his head a few times in the process. Probably not hard enough to cause a concussion. Then she wheeled him to the table, set it to its lowest height, and rolled him onto it. He was still deeply under. She positioned him on his back, arms and legs extended about 45 degrees from his body, then raised the table. One by one, she locked the restraints into place. He would not be moving out of this pose for a while. The IV was next. Luckily, he was fairly well hydrated, or maybe he just had really great veins. She got the line placed easily and started the drip. She added a parenteral nutrition bag next to the saline. This was all the sustenance he would get for the next 3 days, if it took that long. He'd be hungry, but his mind would be sharp when she wanted it to be. She put the pulse oximeter on his toe. He'd be able to pull it off a finger, and the dry electrodes on his back, one under each lung, to monitor his respiration. A quick swipe of the electric thermometer across his forehead told her that his current temperature was normal. She wasn't as practiced with the bladder catheter, but it was a fairly simple procedure, and he wasn't in any state to protest if she did something wrong. There would be enough cleaning up without urine to deal with, too. Thinking of that, she placed the absorbent plastic-lined squares, made for house-training puppies, on the floor all around the operating table. There would definitely be vomit if they needed to go past phase 1. Whether there would be blood depended on how he responded to her normal methods. At least she had working plumbing here. It was turning chilly in the barn, so she covered him with the blanket. She needed him to stay under for a while longer, and cold against his bare skin wouldn't help with that.
All right, let's pop this in the
After
fairway.
a moment of hesitation, she got one of the pillows off a bunk room bed, brought it back, and placed it under his head. It's just because I don't want him to wake up, she assured herself. Not because he looked uncomfortable. She inserted a small syringe into the IV port and gave him another dose of the sleeping agent. He should be good for at least 4 hours. Finally, she slipped the gas mask over his face and screwed a canister onto it. If her safety precautions killed Daniel, she couldn't get the information she needed. She did a final patrol around the perimeter. Through the windows, she could see that all the correct lights were on in the farmhouse. In the dead stillness of the night, she thought she could hear the faint strains of Top 40 pop. Once she was sure that every point of ingress was secured, she ate a protein bar, brushed her teeth in the little bathroom, set her alarm for 3, touched her gun under the cot, hugged her canister to her chest, and then sank into the folds of her sleeping bag. Her body was already asleep, and her brain wasn't far behind. She just had time to slip on her own gas mask before she was totally unconscious. Chapter 6. By 3:30 in the morning, she was up, dressed and fed, still exhausted but ready to start. Daniel slept on, oblivious and peaceful. He would feel well rested when he woke up, but disoriented. He would have no idea what time or even what day it was. Discomfort was an important tool in her line of work. She took his pillow and blanket away, acknowledging the regret this made her feel. But this was important, regardless of training. Every subject felt great discomfort being naked and helpless in front of the enemy. Regret would be the last feeling she would allow herself for a few days. She closed off the rest. It had been more than 3 years, but she could feel things shutting down inside of her. Her body remembered how to do this. She knew she had the strength she would need. Her hair was still wet from the quick color job, and the makeup felt thick on her face, though she wore very little, really. She didn't know how to do anything complicated, so she'd just smeared on dark shadow, thick mascara, and oxblood red lipstick. She hadn't planned to adjust her hair color this soon, but black hair and the camouflage on her face were part of the new strategy. The white lab jacket and pale blue scrubs she'd brought lay crisply folded in her bag. Instead, she was in the tight black shirt again with black jeans. It was a good thing the farmhouse had a washer and dryer. The shirt was going to need a wash soon. Well, it needed one yesterday, actually. It was strange how a little colored powder and grease could change an observer's perception of you. She checked herself in the
2 over for
bathroom
the
mirror
round.
and was pleased by how hard her face looked, how cold. She ran a comb through her hair,
Nice
slicking
solid
it
birdie
straight
on that
back,
last hole.
then
We got
walked
another
through the
birdie
barn
in the
to her
works here.
interrogation room. She'd set up floodlights that hung from the PVC structure overhead, but she left them off now, just turning on 2 portable work lights that stood waist-high. The black duct tape and gray egg foam looked the same color in the shadows. The air temperature had dropped as the night progressed. There were goosebumps on the subject's arms and stomach. She ran the thermometer across his forehead again, still within the normal range. Finally, she turned on her computer and set up the protocols. It would go to screensaver after 20 minutes of inactivity. On the other side of her computer was a small black box with a keypad on top and a tiny red light on the side. But she ignored that now and went to work.
Yeah, we found you in the rough.
There was a feeling
I
that
don't
struggled
think
to
that
break
it's,
through to the surface
in the deep
as
rough.
she injected the IV port with the chemical that would bring the subject around, but she suppressed it easily. Daniel Beach had 2 sides, and so did she. She was her other self now, the one the department called the chemist. And the chemist was a machine. Pitiless and relentless. Her monster was free now. Hopefully, his would come out to play. The new drug trickled into his veins, and his breathing became less even. One long-fingered hand fisted and pulled against the restraint. Although he was still mostly unconscious, a frown touched his features as he tried to roll onto his side. His knees twisted, tugging against the fetters on his ankles, and suddenly his eyes flew open. She stood quietly at the head of the table and watched him panic. His breathing spiked, his heart rate increased, his body thrashed against his bonds. He stared wildly into the darkness, trying to understand where he was, to find something familiar. He stopped suddenly, tense and listening. "Hello?" he whispered. She stood still, waiting for the right moment. For 10 minutes, he alternated between wildly yanking against the restraints and trying to listen around the harsh noise of his breathing. "Help!" he finally called out loudly. "Is anyone there?" "Hello, Daniel," she answered in a quiet voice. His head jerked back, stretching his throat as he looked for where the voice was coming from. It wasn't the instinct of a professional soldier, she noted, to expose the throat that way. "Who's there? Who is that?" "It doesn't really matter who I am, Daniel." "Where am I?" Also not relevant. "What do you want?" he half shouted. "There you go. You got it. That's the question that matters." She walked around the table so he could focus on her, though she was still lit from behind, and her face would be mostly shadows. "I don't have anything," he protested. "No money, no drugs, I can't help you." "I don't want things, Daniel. I need information. And the only way you're getting out of here is if you give it to me." "I don't know anything. Nothing important. Please, stop it," she snapped loudly, and he sucked in a shocked breath. "Are you listening to me now, Daniel? This part is really crucial." He nodded, blinking fast. "I have to have this information. There is no other option. And if I have to, Daniel, I will hurt you until you tell me what I need to know. I will hurt you badly. I don't necessarily want to do this, but it doesn't bother me to do it either. I'm telling you this so that you can decide now, before I begin. Tell me what I want to know, and I will free you."
Okay, looks like we are about
simple.
225
I
yards
promise
to
I
the
will
pin.
not harm you. It will save me time and yourself a lot of suffering. I know you don't want to tell me, but please realize that you are going to tell me anyway. It may take a while, but eventually you won't be able to stop yourself. Everyone breaks. So make the easy choice now. You'll be sorry if you don't. Do you understand? She had given this same speech to many, many subjects in her career, and it was usually quite effective. About 40% of the time, this was when the subject would start confessing. Not often finish confessing, of course, and there was always some exploratory work to do, but there was a decent chance the first admission of guilt and some partial information might be surrendered now. The statistic varied depending on who she was giving the speech to. Roughly half the time with most military men, the first divulgence would happen before any pain was administered. Only 5 to 10% of the actual spies would say anything without some physical distress. Same numbers for religious zealots. For the low-level toadies, the speech worked 100% of the time. The man in charge had never once confessed a single detail without pain.
16th hole coming up.
She really hoped Daniel was just a glorified toady. He stared back at her while she spoke, his face frozen in fear. But then, as she was concluding, confusion narrowed his eyes and pulled his brows together. It wasn't an expression she'd expected. "Do you understand me, Daniel?" His voice bewildered. "Alex? Alex, is that you?" This was exactly why one didn't make contact with a mark beforehand. Now she was
Heading
off script.
for the green here.
"Of course that's not my real name, Daniel. You know that." "What?" "My name isn't Alex." "But you're a doctor. You helped me." "I'm not that kind of doctor, Daniel. And
okay, nice approach.
I didn't help you.
9-footer here, I think.
I drugged you,
think you
and I
this.
kidnapped you." His face was sober. "You were kind to me." She had to control a sigh. "I did what I had to do to get you here. Now I need you to focus, Daniel. I need you to answer my question. Are you going to tell me what I want to know?" She saw doubt in his expression again. Disbelief that she would actually hurt him. That this was really happening. "I'll tell you anything you want to know. But like I said, I don't know anything important. I don't have any bank account numbers or, I don't know, treasure maps or anything. Certainly not anything worth all this."
And that'll keep
He tried to
you at
gesture
1
with
over
his
for the
trust
round.
hand. Looking at himself as he did, he seemed to realize for the first time
Coming
that he
off
was
a
naked.
par on the last
His
one.
skin
Let's see what
flushed,
happens here.
face, neck, and a line down the center of his chest, and he pulled automatically against the restraints as if trying to cover himself. His breathing and heart rate started spiking again. Nudity. Whether Black Ops agents or just low-level terrorist gophers, they all hated it. "I don't want a treasure map. I'm not doing this for personal gain, Daniel. I'm doing this to protect innocent lives. Let's talk about that." "I don't understand. How can I help with that? Why wouldn't I want to?" She didn't like the way this was going. The ones who clung to the claim of ignorance and innocence often took longer to break than the ones who owned their guilt, but were determined not to sell out their government, or their jihad, or their comrades. She walked to the desk and picked up the first picture. It was one of the very clear surveillance shots of De La Fuentes. A close-up. "Let's start with this man," she said, holding the photo at his eye level and using one of the work lights as a spot. Perfectly blank. Absolutely no reaction. A bad sign. "Who is that?" She allowed her sigh to be audible this time. "You're making the wrong choice, Daniel. Please think about what you're doing."
Nice.
"But I don't know who that is." She fixed him with a resigned stare. "I'm being completely honest, Alex. I don't know that man." She sighed again. "Then I suppose we'll get started." The disbelief was there again. She'd never dealt with that in an interrogation before. All the others who'd been on her table had known what they were there for. She'd faced terror and pleading and occasionally stoic defiance, but never this strange, trusting, almost challenge. "You won't hurt me." Is this some kind of fetish fantasy thing?" he asked in a low voice, somehow finding a way to sound embarrassed, despite the bizarreness of his circumstances. "I don't really know the rules for that stuff." She turned away to hide an inappropriate smile. "Get a grip," she ordered herself, trying to keep the movement smooth, as if she'd meant to walk away at that exact moment. She went to her desk. She clicked one key on her computer, keeping it awake. Then she picked up the prop tray. It was heavy, and some of the props clanked against each other as she moved it. She brought the tray to his side, rested the edge of it beside the syringes, and angled the light so the metallic implements shone brightly. "I'm sorry you find this confusing," she said in an even voice. "I am in deadly earnest, I assure you. I want you to look at my tools." He did, and his eyes grew very wide. She watched for some hint of the other side to break through, the dark Daniel.
Okay, let's
there
see
was
what you
nothing.
can do with his 8-footer.
His eyes were somehow still gentle, even in abject fear. Innocent. Lines spoken by Hitchcock's Norman Bates flashed through her head. "I think I must have one of those faces you can't help believing." She shuddered, but he didn't notice, his eyes fixed on her props. "I don't have to use these very often," she told him, touching the pliers lightly, then stroking her finger along the extra-large
over
scalpel.
for the round.
"They call me in when they would like to have the subject left more or less intact."
The 18th hole coming up,
She
and then you
brushed
can
the bolt
hang
cutters
in the
on the hard
clubhouse. Let's see
syllable
what
of the
you can
last
do here.
word. "But I don't really need these tools anyway." She flicked her fingernail against the canister of the welding torch, producing a high-pitched pinging sound. "Can you guess why?" He didn't respond, frozen in horror. He was starting to see now. Yes, this was real. Only Dark Daniel must already have known that. So why wasn't he surfacing? Did he think she could be fooled? Or that his charm on the train had melted her weak, womanly heart? "I'll tell you why," she said in a voice so low it was almost a whisper.
And
She leaned in
you're
conspiratorially
about
and held her
150
face in a
yards
sweet,
from the
regretful
pin, I'd say.
half-smile that didn't touch her eyes. "Because what I do hurts so much worse." His eyes looked like they were going to bug out of his head. This, at least, was a familiar reaction. She took the tray away, letting his focus move naturally to the long line of syringes left behind, glinting in the light. "The first time will last only 10 minutes, she told him, still facing away as she set the tools back on the desk.
Nice.
She spun around,
22
but it will
feet
feel
from the
like a
cup.
lot longer. This will just be a taste. You could look at it as a warning shot. When it's done, we'll try talking again." She picked up the syringe on the far end of the tray, pushed the plunger till a drop of liquid dewed at the top, then flicked it away theatrically, like a nurse in a movie. "Please," he whispered. "Please, I don't know what this is about. I can't help you. I swear I would if I could." "You will," she promised, and she stabbed the needle into his left triceps brachii. The reaction was nearly instantaneous. His left arm spasmed and jerked against the restraint. While he stared in horror at his convulsing muscles, she quietly picked up another syringe and crossed to his right side. He saw her approach. "Alex, please!" he yelled. She ignored him and his attempts to somehow evade her,
Not too
as if
bad.
he were
2
strong
over
enough to
par at
rip
the end
free
your
of his
round.
cuffs, and
Well,
injected
it's
this
off to the
dose of
clubhouse
lactic
for me.
acid into his
Thank you
right
very much
quad.
for the round, and we'll see you next time.
His knee wrenched flat, the muscles pulling his foot off the table. He gasped and then groaned.